Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. As I've indicated previously, these conversations which we're having are specifically designed for the lockdown to help people perhaps who are at home in lockdown to debate some of the critical issues that are facing our country as a result of the pandemic. And today, I'm very delighted to welcome Trudi Makhaya, who is an expert economist and is the advisor on economic affairs to President Ramaphosa, previously having been a distinguished economist in very other areas. Trudi, thank you very much for joining us. And perhaps let me dive in by asking you the following. I'm not particularly, it would be interesting, but that's not the real focus. My focus is clearly that the economy was in fairly bad shape prior to COVID-19 and is going to come through very significant challenges now. So how do you see us resolving these or meeting the challenges that COVID-19 has presented so that when we come out on the other end, we're actually going to be able to deal with the problems of poverty, inequality, etc.?
Thanks, Dennis, and thanks for inviting me for this conversation. Absolutely, I agree. The economy was in bad shape before we went into COVID-19. We had a downturn, an economic downturn. The indicators were not looking good. But I think most specifically to COVID-19 is that we also don't have the arsenal that other countries have in terms of fighting this. And I think that constraint is felt very keenly when we're trying to fight a pandemic and we realize that, or we know that our fiscal situation is not stable. Our debt service costs are going to increase significantly. We're already high, but are going to increase significantly. So I think, it calls for an approach that says we do have to do everything that's possible to deal with the health crisis. So we have to spend what we need to do, what we need to spend on health and containment. And then we also have to do everything that's possible to ensure that we don't lose capacity in the economy, and also that households are not placed in a position where they slide deeper into poverty or into poverty if they were middle class, and are unable to get out of this. So we've got to make sure that we secure livelihoods and we secure business. And I think you've seen this in the economic packages that the president announced, which looked at both securing social grants, increasing social protection for the vulnerable, but at the same time also looking at how to ensure that business is able to go through and survive this period. It's still early days in terms of the impact of those measures, but it's very clear that we couldn't sit back and do nothing as a country and say, oh, we can't afford it, or we can't take an approach which says that we're not going to take on more debt if we can get that debt at affordable rates, which it's clear that we can. The international community has come to the fore to offer concessional finance, and it would be foolhardy for us to say, well, we won't take that money either for ideological or financial reasons. We have to do everything that's possible to ensure that the economy is kept in care and maintenance for a while, and also that when it starts reopening, businesses have the resources to be able to do so. And then there's another step, which the president calls phase 3, of thinking about what does a post-COVID-19 economy look like. COVID has revealed a lot of the vulnerabilities we already knew. Our ability to contain in informal settlements, for instance, is limited by the fact that these don't have adequate sanitation in place. The living arrangements don't allow for social distancing because they're so cramped. We've seen how our public transport could be a vector for transmission. It's a vector for transmission, I guess, everywhere, but particularly ours is vulnerable because people have to sit for these very long distances in cramped taxis. And so we've had, obviously, rules that mitigate against that, but it's also telling us that our public transport system is simply not good enough. So all of these fragilities have been revealed, and so the question becomes, what do we do about it? Is this not an opportunity once and for all to deal with some of these? And even in the health sector itself, we've seen the infrastructure constraints. Isn't it time to deal with these once and for all?
So you said a tremendous amount, and I wanted to see if I can unpack some of that. So let's just start with the first part. I mean, I know I want to come to phase 3, which is very interesting to me. But before I get there, if you look at what you said, I agree. It was obvious that the president and government had to come up with a large package, which I think people like Paul Krugman have described the American package as less of a stimulus and much more of a stabilization package. And I think they're right, that it was to stabilize the economy under a very difficult situation. Of course, what underlined that part, the 500 billion, you can unpack that any way you like, was the fact that in addition to that, we're going to lose a huge amount of money because our tax revenues aren't going to be what they were because the GDP is going to be less. And I see that this week the commissioner suggested that the amount that we could lose in tax could be up to 285 billion, which is roughly 20% of that which we budgeted for in the first place, an astounding amount. So I suppose what I'm really, on that particular point, just before we move on, when you speak about the international agencies being prepared to lend us money and us borrow money from them, it seems to me that one way or another that's going to probably happen. So the question I suppose I wanted to ask you on that is, are they now prepared to do it? I mean, because you obviously also, and I want to come back to the G20, you also, in a sense, now are, because of your position, have access, unique access to that kind of global world. Are these international institutions, whether they be the Chinese bank or the IMF or whoever it is, are they prepared to provide the sort of funding to a country like South Africa without the levels of conditions which would erode our national sovereignty?
Absolutely. So, for instance, at the G20, there was a very strong argument that countries like ours and others of the developing world, and also developed countries too, argued very strongly that this is a global pandemic. It requires a global response. And also that Africa has always had particular vulnerabilities, and so it should not be left behind in the solution to this. And so a consensus has emerged, and there was a strong G20 leader statement that came out to say that the international institutions need to come to the party to ensure that there's financing at concession at low rates that can be advanced to countries that need it. So they were talking to the IMF, the African Development Bank, World Bank, and obviously even the new development bank. China is a G20 member. So then there was frantic work that those institutions did, and they came up with financing that would be separate from the usual. So if we take the IMF, for instance, yes, it would be separate from the usual balance of payments crisis financing that they give when a country is going through trouble. They can't pay for their imports, they can't meet their international obligations. So you go to the IMF and say, well, we're in trouble, help us. And the IMF says, well, we'll help you, but these are the things you need to do. This is not the case. This is a pandemic. It is a totally exogenous factor for almost all economies. I would say it's also even exogenous for China itself. It's an act of nature in some sense. So you can't really ascribe culpability and say this is where policy went wrong, therefore this is why you have this crisis. So there was a recognition that the financing won't come with any conditions. It would simply be that, there would just be an application process. There would be the usual transparency requirements in terms of how that money is spent, but there isn't an expectation of structural reforms that are usually prescribed under these circumstances. So, there won't be a prescription to say, well, to rebalance your financing, you have to sell off your state-owned entities, or you have to cut certain kinds of expenditure. They're not entering that realm. They say, this is the financing. If, this is these are the basic terms and conditions of the financing. I think the IMF comes at just over 1%. Of interest, and these are the reporting requirements. So I think it takes us away from that world of losing sovereignty, because I think it's recognized that this is not that moment.
So can I just ask you? I don't want to necessarily, because it's difficult to speculate on these matters. But I mean, if, for example, through all the international institutions, if it did turn out that we were sort of 285 billion short, which I suppose in dollar terms is something around the region of $15 billion, are we talking that in broad terms, the international institutions realize that they may have to stump up that sort of level of money to keep countries like South Africa in a position where we can continue to develop for our own good as we move out of COVID-19? I mean, are we talking about, a significant sum of money that would allow us to actually emerge out of this without disastrous consequences, whereby we would, either have to do punitive taxes, which we couldn't afford in the first place, or alternatively other measures which would be detrimental to economic growth in the longer term?
I think there are cushions to that question around would we be overexposed? I mean, I think in essence that's the concern there. And on our side, I mean, the cushion is that there's a package that is limited. 500 billion is what we're looking at. Within that, there would be reprioritization of government financing. So the gap is lower than that. There would also be other sources of finance, or some of it doesn't have to be financed because it's a guarantee. You don't know what the risk is going to look like in a guarantee scheme, because you're only really held accountable when the loans go bad. Similarly, tax deferments will be paid at some stage. So that gap becomes manageable. So there's that. It's not like we're asking for unlimited amounts from our side. From the institution side, they've also worked out limits for each country. So, for instance, at the IMF, it's the limit that is calculated like against your quota of reserves at the IMF. So there's also a limit from that point. And you still have to think about sustainability of this debt as a country, nonetheless. You can't, take on what you can't. So I don't foresee punitive taxes in future. When the Minister of Finance tables the revised budget, the exact size that needs to be filled will be shared. And also, as always, there will be a 3-year horizon where it's shown what's the deficit, what's the gap for the next 3 years, and also I think there's an attempt to say when will debt stabilize. And there'll be also transparency around what are the debt service costs going to be over the next 3 years. So I think in terms of transparency and cushion,
carry on.
I'm saying that there's enough to give reassurance about how much we're actually going to be in for.
All right, well, let me put this to you. When you looked at the budget, the one that I agree has now become somewhat less relevant than it was previously, the growth rates were 0.9%, 1.3%, and 1.8% for the next 3 years. And with greatest respect, I mean, those tepid levels of growth we're not going to get South Africa into the kind of zone that we need. In other words, if we are going to reduce unemployment and provide 55 million odd people with the ability to live a dignified life, we were going to need significantly higher growth rates than those. Now we're in a position after COVID-19 where, in fact, even those growth rates would seem to me to be rather optimistic, to be blunt. So the question is, how do we actually then, in this phase 3, as it were, as we move out of COVID-19, how do we actually start thinking through the fact that we're going to have to look to growth rates far more significant than that to address the social problems that we've inherited prior to COVID-19 and now?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I have a stock presentation that I share with people where I try to scare them. And this was long before COVID-19, to say, the economic path that the economy was on was unsustainable. And perhaps the growth model that we had was no longer generating any growth. We can't call it a growth model. We were on a path that was, not only unsustainable, but possibly extinct. So even before this, we had to think about new sources of growth. Now, if you go back to the President's State of the Nation, which obviously is outdated by some of the elements of COVID-19, but if you look at what he was talking about in terms of fixing the fundamentals of growth and ensuring that we have a basis for a competitive economy. So he talked about things like going through with energy sector reform and ensuring that we have a stable electricity supply industry. He talked about the network industries, the telecoms, the transport, and revitalizing those. So that still needs to happen under any scenario. But that's also looking at just the fundamentals of the economy. It doesn't give you that lift-off. So he also talks about things that we think the lift-off could come from if we reorient our economy towards those. And so he talked, for instance, about performance-based industrial policy that supports sectors of the economy that are innovative, that are growing, but doing so in a way that it's not just giving out subsidies or money, but targeted and supporting private sector to reorient itself into a new competitive economy. He also talks about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which I think, a lot of work goes into it, but has not been quite internalized, I don't think, by the South African public. That, our economy has been, resource intensive, focused on exporting those resources to the likes of China, or automotives to the likes of Europe, for instance, or some manufacturing that we do have. But we haven't taken the opportunity to trade within our continent, where it's clear that if you look at the export basket that we trade with the continent versus the export basket that we trade with the rest of the world, the continent tends to demand more value-added goods from us and less commodity-driven goods. So if we really want to deepen our manufacturing, we have to go deeper into the continent. The challenge, of course, is a transition issue. We have big markets in China, big markets in Europe. We don't want to lose them. We want to maintain them. At the same time, we have to meet this new demand, and it will start much smaller. So it's easy to ignore, but that's where the future is.
But if I could, sorry, you make your point. Sorry.
So I was just going to go through the elements. So the other way to reorient the economy was also around cleaner growth and greener economic growth. Also controversial because of transition issues. We have a set, established, fairly functioning coal-based economy. And so how do you get into a green economy that doesn't exclude people, especially people who have made livelihoods out of this economy, who are working class people, etc., who are in mining. And once again, he talks about how this is going to be progressive. And it's also not just only about energy, it's about the green economy more broadly. It's about thinking more creatively about the waste economy. It's about thinking more creatively around the circular economy notions, where the idea is to minimize resource use and keep resources circulating within an economy before you discard them. Thinking differently about our commodities also. We have commodities that like vanadium, platinum, rhodium, manganese, that face demand for clean tech. So you have to shift your commodity basket a bit. It's not like you stop being a mining country, but you think about what are the materials that are needed for green production. So that's another reorientation, which I think could change this economy. And it also speaks to low-income communities in terms of greening those communities. Changing, those are often the communities that are most affected by smog, pollution, congestion. So if you think about green urban design and changing all of that, and also doing it in a labor-intensive way. And I know we failed in the past in this. There have been solar water heater projects that haven't gotten anywhere. There have been green building projects that haven't gotten anywhere. But I think if we focus and put concerted effort into this, we could rebuild infrastructure and the economy.
Sorry to interrupt you. I agree with you. But let me just go back, because again, you made a number of points. I just want to take them one by one. In the short run, at least, the idea of the export markets are going to be really problematic because other countries are equally in COVID-19 problems. So the idea that we're going to have massively expanding export markets over the next 6 months to a year to 2 years, probably very unrealistic because those economies are going to be struggling and their GDPs are going to go down. So I agree with you. If you then move on to the imaginative stuff, the stuff that obviously you've spoken about the green economy, and I agree. The question is, and it's possible to have a green economy in which, if you start moving away from coal, you can generate sufficient, as it were, funding that you can retrain some of those workers who otherwise would lose jobs. You've got to think imaginatively about this. What I suppose I'm asking on that point, and also in relation to the 5G and the whole thing that's been going on forever with our digital program, isn't the real question this? We all know that these have to be done. And if they're not done, as it were, the president gets up and says, look, these are the deals I've got to do. I'm reminded that in the 1930s, when Roosevelt was faced with the Depression and he started the New Deal, he actually said, this is what we're going to do in the next 6 months, and he did it. Isn't that the real challenge that we've got now? We can't carry on talking. We've got to do it.
So some of it was being done before I think all efforts went into COVID. So the energy sector reform had begun. Spectrum, the process is underway still. So it's, I think we should acknowledge that path, was already well underway. I think there's a question.
But a lot of people don't think it was underway. That's the problem. I mean, before COVID-19, with great respect, there were a lot of people who were not sure exactly because we were getting mixed signals. And the point about investors, whether local or international, they don't want mixed signals. They want to know that's what's going to happen. And by goodness, we're going to do it in the next period. And surely that's exactly what's got to happen now. We've got to have a new deal of our own kind, and we've got to make sure that we do it within realistic but defined time limits.
No, I mean, I would challenge the mixed signals issue in that, I mean, if you think about, for instance, the week before COVID-19, in terms of just the flurry of regulatory work that was done in liberalizing some aspects of energy, in looking at digital migration itself and spectrum, there was a lot in there. And maybe it hadn't registered. And I'm one of those people who'd say, we don't have to talk about this every step of the way. It will register when you see results, and it's fine that there's skepticism until you see those results. I accept that, but it's not as if nothing was being done. But secondly, but to your point, I think COVID-19 and the crisis and the emergency we're in did energize people and bring certain formations together, business and labor working closer together, never mind business and government, but also business, civil society, getting closer, initiatives like the Solidarity Fund. You're seeing different kinds of partnerships that are emerging, which I think would be useful for implementation going forward, and will set us well for the kinds of accords that we need, because these are controversial issues that have to be done. For instance, for energy, you need a really strong accord that brings everyone along. And I think we've now established those institutions. NEDLAC is re-energized. There's more happening there that will enable trade-offs, difficult trade-offs to be discussed. In terms of governments working, I think the President has also talked about this openly, that he had been concerned about government capacity. He said he should have made that the first priority, and that he's going to focus on that and make sure that the state is given the capacity to be able to work faster and more effectively. I think he recognizes that there is a policy backlog that needs to be resolved quickly, and I think government and the machinery sees that it can move quickly when implementation very key. But it's something that the President has his eye on.
I appreciate that he has his eye on it. It's the question that has got to translate it from his eye to the situation where that these are done. But let me move on then to one other thing. If you accept that exports are going to be tricky, there are other areas of the economy that are going to be tricky as well, which is why I find the debate, not a debate that you've promoted, but so I'm not talking about you, but you've read it as much as I am, and I'm sure it frustrates you as much as it does me, which is this binary debate between lockdown and no lockdown. Because even if you had no lockdown, there would be areas of the economy that are simply not going to be able to get up and running because the nature of COVID-19 is such that we're not going to have a tourism industry for the next 6-9 months, maybe a year, until such time as people feel confident enough to travel internationally, etc. The same is probably true of restaurants, entertainment, major sporting events, etc. So the question is, if all of these sectors of the economy, which are employment creators in the ordinary course, aren't going to be up and running, whatever we do, then I suppose the real question is, where do we focus our attention to ensure those that can, as it were, emerge, notwithstanding the fact that COVID-19 may be with us for some time? Isn't the third phase going to have to be one which takes account of the fact that certain parts of this economy are outside our control until such time as we get a vaccine, and then concentrate on the others?
So, I mean, I think a lot of the effort and the work that's being done is to put as much within our control as possible in terms of, ensuring workplaces are ready and mitigation. But absolutely, some things are just not, aviation is just not within anyone's control at the moment. And so phase 3 does have to think about, it's not only about blue sky, how do we remodel the economy, but it's also very about what's the path to the recovery. How do we ensure that the recovery is as robust as possible, given the limits that we have? And a lot of work is going into the different levels to ensure that everything that can be operational is operational. Now, I know there's been lots of debates about some of the missteps or some of the disagreements about what is allowable and what's not. And I think people should just approach it in a constructive way and try to bring as much evidence to bear to say, well, this doesn't make sense. Here's a different way to do it. I don't think anyone is wedded to any regulation. It's an emergency, it's passing. How we manage it has to be just optimized and just reacting on the evidence that they see. But I do agree, we have to focus on those areas. So for instance, agriculture has to be up and running and functioning. And we also have to make sure that the value chains associated that make it possible, whether it's transport, a bit of manufacturing here and there, that facilitate agricultural products moving and getting to markets, should be done. So agreed. There's a lot of thinking that's also happening at the Presidential Economic Advisory Council on what is that path? But secondly, then how does it position us for the future? But yes, agreed that everything has to be done to ensure that the economy functions as optimally as possible. But of course, watching what epidemiologists and others are saying in terms of the data that's coming out and in terms of our ability to control the virus.
I accept that. And that means that if I read what Professor Karim is extraordinarily impressive, and we should be so proud that we have someone like that leading that whole program, has said, I mean, it's perfectly clear to me that we're going to be perhaps in the height of this in August, September, and it may only be by the end of the year that we're starting to get into a more manageable proportion, which is why the challenge is there. But I'm running out of time, and I want to ask you one final question, because you're privileged to have kind of connection with the G20. And what I really wanted to ask you in relation to that was this. It seems to me that in a world where you have people like Donald Trump, there are tendencies to be more nationalistic, to look inwardly, and to only, as it were, worry about your own, or at least only part of your own, if you're Trump, not all your own. And on the other hand, the more international response. And I'm curious from your vantage point, whether you think as we move out of COVID-19, there will be a greater impetus towards international governance of the kind of crises that we've seen thanks to COVID-19, or whether you think, unfortunately, we're going to all retreat into our own borders.
It's a tough one. So, I mean, what we've seen just in terms of our engagements with, at the G20 with different countries is that some, maybe it reinforces national tendencies. Some have jumped for the opportunity to try and build global institutions and to strengthen those, whereas others have been far more reluctant. Reflecting, I guess, the governance philosophy that they have at the moment. I think COVID obviously speaks to both impulses. You want to close your borders, isolate, keep yourself safe. At the same time, you can't have any solutions that are national. It's not sustainable. You can't lock yourself up. You can't lock your economy up forever. To open up our economies, to open up global movement, will require, as it has been said, that one infection in Africa means that it hasn't been beaten. It could reestablish itself. So there's no country that could confidently say we've beaten COVID and we're going to be global players without, taking that into consideration. So I think international governance, there's been a lot of attempt in leader statements and other gestures by the G20 to reaffirm institutions that have done a very good job. So if you look at the WHO, it has been really good in leading this. And you can't imagine trying to lead a pandemic like this without a WHO. I was listening to a country that's not in the WHO, and they were trying to explain how they're trying to scramble to understand this without access to that peer learning. It becomes impossible. Similarly, WTO, the World Trade Organization, is going to be a very big part of this. We spent a lot of time at the G20. Obviously, it's just advocacy that we can do in relation to WTO to try to say we need a fair, rules-based international trading system. It's not about might is right. It's not about big countries, but it's about ensuring that now, post-COVID, we're not going to have trade barriers and price gouging on international markets. We're not going to have unfair trade in pharmaceuticals. You need a strong World Trade Organization.
That's the point I wanted to press. That's what the opportunity surely is to start thinking about what a fair, equitable international governance system is post-COVID-19. And that means that countries like ours can play a role in helping to assist that. We may be having to do this without the United States of America, sadly, but that doesn't matter. It's got to have to be done, surely. And I suppose what I really wanted to ask by way of final question was, when you talk to the other countries, absent the United States, I take it from what you're telling me that there is a realization that that is the only option available to us going forward.
And people get it. That is the option. And also that developing countries have to have a much, much greater stake in the decisions that are taken and also what happens at those organizations. And also on the point of the US, there's the formal governance and what happens there. There's also what Americans actually do in terms of at state level, at company level, that is often very supportive of the global governance system. So I think that also needs to be brought into bear, that, even multinationals get it, that you have to do this and approach it at a global level. And South Africa has been at a very great vantage point, also being chair of the African Union, that we can bring that continental voice and say, this is what these issues look like from our vantage point, and that is what a fair world could look like. But we're far from that, of course.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we've run out of time. We carry on this conversation for a very long time because they raise all of these profound questions of how, in fact, our economy has to be restructured during this period, after this period, and how this global governance going to be restructured after these periods. These are the challenges which perhaps a year ago we wouldn't even have thought were going to be absolutely critical to our time, but they are. Trudi, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for sharing these thoughts with us. We're very grateful. And I hope that the people who've listened to this will have some stuff to debate going forward. Thank you.